All right, me. It is the end of February, and I finally finished reading Ernest Cline's Ready Player One. This is the second time I've read this book, either second or third time, because I read this when I was in high school, and I may have read it during my freshman year of college again. But then obviously I finished reading it today. It took me a lot longer to read than it should have, but that comes from, obviously a change of scenery. I started reading this on my flight back down to North Carolina to pick up the last of my things. And then read it a little bit here, a little bit on a drive down to Muncie that we just had to do today, and then finished it out after our Muncie trip that we had to take. But right, it certainly took a lot longer, but that's because there's so much else going on in terms of getting here and being here and getting myself set up and moving into a whole new situation and getting myself prepped for that whole new situation and everything. But yeah. Ready Player One, as the book itself, right? It within itself is a utopian piece of literature, or a dystopian piece of literature, but I think it does it in a very different way than what we, I would say, normally are used to, because it goes for this, like, I was describing to Matt, my now roommate, who also works at camp with me, and it was like, yeah, it's kind of like this WALL-E sort of situation in which you're looking at not necessarily a dystopian world that gets imagined with like traditional teenage dystopia, but rather it is a dystopia that exists because we have created a separate world where we can be anything that we want to be. And then because of that, we end up ignoring and destroying our own personal world, right? Because it's so much easier to escape than it is to fix, right? Which is, I think, a very, very important discussion that has to happen all the time, right? Especially early, even more now, that we need to constantly be aware of this, right? Constantly be aware of this idea that, like, yes, it is so easy and it is so nice to exist and live in a world in which, right, everything gets to go exactly according to plan and how we want it to be, and it's perfect, and we get to look and be whoever we want to be. But that doesn't solve the actual issues. We just get to play pretend in a world that does. So yeah, right. That's the dystopia that we're existing in here, right? Because we're following Wade Watts, also known as Parzival, and kind of Wade Watts's journey throughout, all of this. And we're living in a dystopian world in which people are getting poorer and poorer and poorer. And so the only lasting existence or lasting piece of escape that exists is the Oasis, which is a virtual reality, alternative reality world that pretty much everyone is into all the time, right? And the currency and that world is almost equivalent to the real world, right? So you're constantly bouncing back and forth between the two, and the creator of the Oasis dies, and there is this huge treasure hunt, Easter egg hunt, where if you were the first person to complete this Easter egg hunt, you then get all of the money and the ownership of all this property, and so you become the most influential person in the world, and in all of human history, effectively you become the most influential person in the world. And it's, a group of ragtag individuals that are all from these kind of geeky, nerdy backgrounds, that have more or less succumbed to this isolation, versus a huge corporate sponsorship, right? And this huge corporatization of exploiting the rules and exploiting the gamification of things, to then get, what they want, right? Which is obviously ownership, and then be the ability to sell more things and sell and sell and sell and sell and sell, which is obviously very similar to some situations we find ourselves in right now, right? Of just like everything needs to be sold, everything needs to be corporatized, and all of this, and yeah. See, Ready Player One's it's a fun read, right? I'm in kind of this middle ground for, I think, this piece, because what Ready Player One is that it is this kind of, it is a huge amount of pop culture and nerdy geeky stuff from the 1980s, and then kind of into the early 1990s, that is really, really important to kind of like the development and the pop culture that we think of today when we think of like nerdom and we think of geekdom, right? It is the Dungeons and Dragons of it all. It is the creations and really the first usage and popularization of the at-home video game market, and things like that, right? But also sticking to seeing more or less the phasing out, but also still, strong popularity of, the arcade and the 80s, teenage movie and things like that, right? And all of this is like super, super ingrained within what makes Ready Player One. Because I'm in this kind of weird space in which I am someone who certainly was not born in the 80s, right? I was born in 2000, but has, this great love and fantasy of geekdom and nerdom and things, and pop culture in that sense, as well as, someone who has spent a good amount of time online, right? And having lived in a generation that for about a 5-6 year period was really in love with what the 80s was, I know a lot of these things, right? But I'm not ingrained into where it is the perfect world for me, right? So it's someone, I think this speaks to someone who is just slightly older than me, in terms of, really, really hitting home with all these things and all these references and whatnot. Yeah. So that's that. The book's a little interesting in some cases, right? Because it's like, it is a science fiction novel, and so we are exploring a lot of themes and a lot of concerns that exist, right? It's hard to not imagine a world in which the media that we consume isn't absolutely dominated by huge, massive corporations, right? The indie game market is still thriving, yes, but is still dominated by money-making machines, right? It's still dominated by EA, right? Most of our media comes from like 3 or 4 companies, right? And so it's weird to still be in that situation. So it speaks really, really on that, but also it's weird to read this same thing, but from a teenager who is about 10 years behind, right? And so, you have some of these kind of weird, or I shouldn't say weird, right? Because it is a teenage boy that we are reading from. But it's like, oh yeah, that's when he's talking about interactions with women and the way that he addresses people and things like that, right? and the way that he thinks about life and the world and all this, right? It's a little sometimes. But yeah, yeah. You know, you also have fucking Anorak, who is what's his, I don't remember his real name. James Halliday. That's the actual name of the character in the book. James Halliday, who is like this embodiment and envisionment of what we think of the word nerd, right? Is someone who has completely destroyed their lives and like only wants to exist in a virtual world and has like no ability to communicate with people at all, right? That sort of character. And then it's also this kind of long-standing obsession that leads to everything, right? Of his obsession with one girl, that really kind of causes everything to break apart and work the way it does. And it's just a really like but yeah, you know, I mean, overall it's a fun read, right? It's, if you grew up in the 80s, or if you, like me, and you lived through a generation that was all about the 80s and was really interested in bringing the 80s back, you know, it's a fun read. I wouldn't say you get a lot out of it, but you know, it's certainly fun and it's enjoyable. I don't remember watching the movie, but I remember this movie came out roughly at the same time that Pixels did, maybe. And so that was another, you know, kind of bombing of the video game movie industry, which still continues to bomb to this day. Yeah, that's Ready Player One by Ernest Cline. Yeah, first book I read at Crosley. As a full-time staff member, I read other books at Crosley. But yeah.